So by now it should be Monday, February 25th, I hope. And as you can see, we have a special guest today. This is Miss Piper London. If y'all haven't seen pictures yet, which I don't know how you haven't, because they have been splattered all over social media for the past couple of days. But anyway, she's just going to kind of help me teach a little bit today. So Friday we finished talking about the supply curve and how it can be affected, how it can be changed. Today, picking up on page 62, we're talking about supply and demand imbalance and how that the supply curve and the demand curve coincide and affect one another. So on page 62, middle right of the page, we have what pays under capitalism is satisfying the common man, the customer. The more people you satisfy, the better for you. Ludwig von Mises. The price of a good is a signal that producers or suppliers and consumers or demanders watch. This important factor guides the economic decisions that people make. In order to illustrate how price affects supply and demand, we will continue our example of bicycles. Yay. Suppose the price of bicycles were to go up sharply from the existing level. If this happened, fewer people would buy new bicycles. They would repair their old ones or get along without any. Some people would continue to buy new bicycles despite the higher prices, but overall the quantity of bicycles demanded would diminish. As the quantity demanded falls, the price of bicycles would diminish as suppliers realized they could not sell all their wares at the higher price level. Ooh, bless you. With the advent of lowering prices, the demand for bicycles would increase. Or we can look at it another way in terms of supply. If the price of bicycles go up, makers of bicycles will be encouraged to increase production, causing quantity supplied to increase. Because it takes considerable time for existing... Okay, so Piper kind of got a little bit fussy there while we were still in the hospital, but now we're home, so I'm going to try to get this video finished up. Because it takes considerable time for existing firms to manufacture and distribute an increased number of bicycles, this increase in the quantity of bicycles supplied will not occur immediately. Once all these new bicycles come into the market, their prices will fall because the larger quantity supplied has more than satisfied the existing quantity demanded for bicycles. Because it will then be harder to sell these new bicycles, bicycle manufacturers will reduce their production. When production is reduced, the supply of new bicycles will decrease. Supply and demand will have come into balance once more. Economists often use diagrams showing curves of supply and demand placed on the same graph to illustrate these principles. Prices are important not because money is paramount, but because prices are a fast and effective conveyor of information through a vast society in which fragmented knowledge must be coordinated. Thomas Sowell. If you look at figure K, at the top right of page 63, you can see that it's showing a graph that's talking about the equilibrium of supply and demand, which we'll get to here in just a minute. But you can see that it actually has both curves on that graph. You have a supply curve and you have a demand curve, and how those two interact with one another. So Mr. Mendoza is uncertain whether a suggested retail price of $800 for his mountain bikes would cover his full costs of production and distribution. He would be happy to sell his bicycles to wholesalers and retailers at a factory price that would permit those dealers to retail the bicycles for $1,000 each. But he wonders whether this relatively high price might not be resisted by potential customers at retail cycle shops. In other words, he does not know whether this particular price will change the demand. His market researchers now show him the third diagram in which the demand and supply curves are drawn on the same graph, figure K, that we talked about at the top of the page just a second ago. In this diagram, the two curves meet at the price of $900, which is the equilibrium. Equilibrium is the point at which quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal. It's at this point that suppliers such as Mr. Mendoza try to find in order to know what price to place on the goods and how many goods to produce at that price. The market researchers calculated that 10,000 customers would be willing to pay $900 for a new mountain bike. Sellers try to offer prices that will attract the greatest possible number of buyers at the greatest profit to themselves. If the computations of the research firm are fairly accurate, the general market price of bicycles in the Minneapolis area will be approximately $900. So to put this into terms that we understand, the other day we talked about Apple and the iPhone market, and we were talking about, I was able to pull up their sales numbers for the fourth quarter of 2018, how many iPhones they sold, and at approximately what price. And the reason that we need to know this information is so that we can gauge the market and how it's changing on a quarterly basis. If you've ever wondered, why does Apple come out with 4 different versions of each iPhone? I mean, you've got the iPhone X, the iPhone XS, the iPhone XL, the iPhone XXL. But anyway, I know. The reason for that is partially they want to give the customers options, but also partially they want to see what type of pricing they can get away with. If you look at the differences in pricing between the different models of iPhone, you can see that they're kind of gauging a scale of, well, how much will someone pay before a 1/4 inch larger screen size is not enough? At what point is the amount demanded going to begin to go down because it's not worth that price to a consumer? So it's not just marketing in the sense of, well, this one has a little bit of a bigger screen, it also costs a little bit more, it has another feature that this one doesn't have. They're also using that to gauge the market and gauge the supply and demand curve for iPhones so that they can adjust it accordingly and adjust it for the next model that comes out, this year in September or whatever, whenever they have their expo. So, of course, no one can be sure in advance precisely what the demand, supply, and equilibrium price will be for any particular good at any particular time. But reasonable estimates can often be made. And that's why we keep track of those numbers of sales made in each quarter. So you can adjust your price quarterly, you can adjust your price yearly. But you've got to keep track of those numbers, or else how are you going to have any idea of how many iPhones sold at what price and whether you should change the price up or down based upon those numbers? You have to keep track of all that. Without fairly reliable information, suppliers of a good may not produce enough to satisfy consumer demand at the price for which that good is sold. The result is a shortage, the situation in which the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied at a given price. I was trying to think of a good example of a shortage that's happened in recent years, and the first thing that came to mind was the Nintendo Switch when it came out. If you remember a couple years ago when the Nintendo Switch came out, it was supposed to be the best new gaming console that's ever existed, and demand for it was ridiculous. They would have 50 units shipped into Walmart, they'd be gone the next day. And eventually it got to the point where no one even stocked them, or if they did stock them, they were being sold by third parties at almost twice the price of the original. And what was the reason for that? It was because there was a shortage. Nintendo underestimated the number of units that they would sell at the price that they offered it at. I mean, they were offering a Nintendo Switch at a price that was comparable, if not beating, other consoles. And they were offering some games that were available exclusively on the Switch, or that were available on other consoles, that would encourage people who normally would not buy a Nintendo product, because sometimes Nintendo limits their product lines to certain more family-friendly items, stuff like that. But they're offering titles that once were considered to only be available on Xbox or PS4. And so the demand for the Switch skyrocketed. And we had what was called a shortage. There was not enough goods supplied to meet the demand. On the other hand, if the quantity supplied of a good is greater than the quantity demanded at a given price, there will be a surplus. Surpluses seem to happen a lot more often than shortages. Any day that you walk into Walmart, they have a clearance aisle where they'll have one particular item on a shelf all by itself that they have 300 of, and that's been marked down to 50% or 75% off the price. Well, why is that? Well, whoever produced that product either miscalculated the demand or miscalculated the supply, one or the other. Either they thought, well, this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread, and we're going to sell millions of this item. And it didn't happen. Okay, so either they miscalculated the demand, not enough people bought it, or they miscalculated the supply, we're going to need this many because this is the demand, but they released it at the wrong time. And although demand was high for that product, or may have been high at a different time, at that particular time, nobody needed it. I mean, you don't buy sprinkler systems in January, right? So it kind of balances out. Long-term shortages and surpluses are most often found in countries with command economies, since suppliers lack the market signals available in free market economies. So now that Mr. Mendoza has some concept of how big the market for his wares in Minneapolis is and what the market price for bicycles may be, he can calculate accordingly whether it be worth his while to promote Mendoza bicycles in the Minneapolis region. If he cannot produce a bicycle that would sell for a suggested retail price of $900 while leaving him some margin of gain, he will stay out of the Minneapolis market. Meanwhile, the people who are not prepared to pay $900 for bicycles will either have to buy used ones or bicycles of inferior quality unless they are lucky enough to find a dealer who holds a going out of business sale or offers bicycle bargains for a short period of time. So this goes way back to basic principles of economics. We're talking about gain. What are we talking about when we speak of gain or profit? Okay, we're talking about the amount of money that's left over after we've paid all the costs associated with producing a particular product. I mean, we talked about the gallon of milk example, right? You're not just paying the farmer whose cow gave the milk. You're paying that farmer. You're paying for the cow's feed. You're paying for the guy that mucks out the stalls. You're paying for the guy that picks up the milk at the farm in a truck and drives it to the factory. You're paying the people at the factory salaries who are pasteurizing the milk and bottling it or jugging it. You're paying the guy that picks up the milk at the factory and drives it to the store. You're paying the stock guy in the back who puts this milk from the truck onto the shelf. I mean, and you're paying the cashier that checks you're out at the grocery store, and you're paying the bagger that bags the milk. I mean, it's a big, long supply chain. And so you have to account for each and every single step of that chain. I mean, we're talking with Mr. Mendoza's example of bicycles. He needs to make a good profit margin. And you're thinking, well, it can't cost more than $300 to make a bike. Yeah, all said and done, I mean, he could easily be paying $700 to produce this bike, and then he only makes $200 profit if he sells it for $900. He could be doing as much as this bike costs $825 to make, and he only makes $75. You never know the exact cost behind things unless you do the research and go back in and figure out exactly what it costs. Let's see, where were we? So there will always be people who will not pay the market price for an item. I'm a bargain shopper. If I can absolutely help it, I do not pay sticker price on anything. I will find a coupon code. I will find somewhere that has it on sale and will price match. So there's always people like that. And if they're not going to pay $900 for a bicycle, they're not going to pay $900 for a bicycle. They'll find another way. They'll buy used. They'll find somewhere that has it on sale and is willing to take a slight loss, or maybe not even a loss. Maybe they're just willing to accept less profit. So no retailer in ordinary circumstances can afford to sell much for less than the general market price. And then I underline this in the text that I'm reading from. Nobody is in business to lose money. Okay? If you start a business, the idea of your business is not, I'm going to produce a product and sell it at a loss because it's just a great idea and everybody needs this. No. Nobody goes into business to get into debt and lose money. You're trying to make a profit. You're trying to make a gain off of it, in addition to, perhaps, supplying a product that everybody really needs and can't live without. The diagrams make the point that price is set where supply and demand come into balance, or equilibrium. If most Minneapolis customers were willing to pay only $800 for a bicycle, not enough bicycles would be offered to satisfy the public's demand. If bicycles were priced at $1,000, dealers would not find enough customers to buy their stocks. As a result of free exchange in the market, Sellers have to reduce the price they charge, and buyers have to pay more than they would like to pay. This is the essential function of the market, the manifestation of Adam Smith's invisible hand, bringing together producers and consumers to make exchanges that are the best possible for both groups. Sellers ready to sell bikes for $900 each can dispose of their stock. Buyers ready to pay $900 for bikes can obtain what they want. This is an example of what we call clearing the market. Of course, sellers who demand higher prices or buyers who cannot or will not pay the market price are excluded from this market. So we have the effects of a change in supply or demand on equilibrium. As the supply and demand of a good shift, the equilibrium price of that good also shifts. So they're directly related and correlate to each other. Suppose, for instance, that Mrs. Wallace, the owner of a shop that sells clothes to young women, orders 20 Fair Isle sweaters every month. These sweaters are made in Scotland and are of high quality. Though through experience, she has found that she can sell all 20 sweaters each month if she prices them at $60 each. If Fair Isle sweaters suddenly went out of fashion and another kind of sweater became popular, Miss Wallace might find it necessary to sell her out-of-style sweaters at the bargain price of $45 apiece in order to dispose of her stock. This decrease in demand caused by a change in consumer preference can be seen in Figure L. Notice how the demand curve shifted to the left from D0 to D2, and the equilibrium price moved from $60 to $45. So if you look at that diagram down at the bottom right of the page, we have D0, which is the demand curve originally, right? Because they were originally demanded at $60. Then they went out of fashion. So, it's just like any other fad. It goes out of style. So the demand curve changes and shifts. So if something goes out of fashion, what's going to happen to the demand? It's going to decrease, right? So they show you on this graph, we go from D0 to the left where it says D2. So has the supply changed? Did she stop buying as many sweaters? Not right now. In this particular example, she's already bought them. I mean, sometimes that can happen. If you're buying something from China and it takes 3 weeks to get to you, and in 1.5 weeks from the time you order it, the demand for that item suddenly drops off. I mean, you can't sit back and say, sorry, this wasn't a good idea. You've just got to take the loss. So, the supply hasn't changed. She still has 20 sweaters. What has changed is the demand. It's decreased. So, our equilibrium price, which is shown by the black dots on the graph there, goes down and to the left. So, because the demand shift decreases, the demand decreased, the equilibrium price also decreased. Or suppose, on the contrary, that Fair Isle sweaters became more fashionable than ever before. Demand for them increases overnight, causing a shortage of those sweaters. The price that consumers are willing to pay rises, and the proprietress of the shop finds that she can sell more sweaters for more money than before. The increase in the demand for sweaters is illustrated by the rightward shift in Figure L's demand curve from D0 to D1. So again, looking at that graph on page 64 at the bottom right, we have D0, which is the original demand curve, and then suddenly they gain popularity. How often do we have a product that overnight becomes a sensation and suddenly everybody wants one? I don't think that one day the guy who came up with the idea to make a fidget spinner thought, this is going to be the next yo-yo. Maybe he did. Maybe he was just visionary and genius in his idea. But I don't think he got up one day and said, I'm going to invent this device that's just going to take the world by storm and I won't be able to keep up with it. And then suddenly the next day, it's exploded. Every kid wants it. So it literally can happen overnight in that way. Or if, a Hollywood star suddenly wears this particular brand of clothes or this particular shirt, suddenly the demand for that item, which may have been just mediocre the day before, skyrockets. And so while the example sounds kind of silly, okay, sweaters, nobody's really going to suddenly go, I must have this sweater lest I die. It does happen. So the demand curve shifts from D0 to D1. So the demand is suddenly increasing. And what's going to happen to the equilibrium price point? It's going to increase as well, as shown by the black dot on D1, where the supply and demand curves meet. The equilibrium price of a good may also change when supply changes. So we've talked about demand and how that curve can shift equilibrium price. Well, let's talk about the supply curve and how that can affect equilibrium price. These effects of shifts in the supply curve for Mrs. Wallace's sweater are illustrated in figure M. If the demand for Fair Isle's goods were to remain steady, but Mrs. Wallace decided to order more sweaters every month, she would have a surplus unless she lowered the price of each sweater in order to give the consumers the incentive to buy her increased supply. The effect is shown by the new equilibrium price on the supply curve shifts right from S0 to S1. Okay, so suddenly demand is not changing, but supply is going to change this time. So suddenly she starts to order more sweaters. Let's say it's Christmas time and she's expecting that she'll need 20 more sweaters than she normally sells. Well, okay, suddenly they go kind of out of style, or they're just not as crucial as they were before. So suddenly she has 40 sweaters instead of the normal 20 she sells. So can she still sell them for $65? No, right? Look at the graph. S0 to S1. See the black dots that recommend, or that stand for the equilibrium price point. On S0, the equilibrium price point is at $60. On S1, the equilibrium price point is at $45. Okay, so she has to sell them at a discount in order to offload the sweaters. Or if Mrs. Wallace decided that her supply of Fair Isle sweaters takes up too much space, she might order fewer sweaters each month, a leftward shift. So again, now we're going, the supply is lowering. We're going from S0 to S2. With this decreased supply of sweaters, she would find that she can sell each sweater for more money than she was getting for them before. So again, we were talking about the Nintendo Switch and supply being available. When supply is suddenly dropped and you have a shortage, and we talked about the people who were selling the Nintendo Switch for almost double the price on eBay or Amazon or other places like that, that's what happens. It's a literal, real-world example. If suddenly this item is not available and everyone wants it, what can you do? You can raise the price. You can get more money out of it than you were able to before. And part of this can be seen in the idea of collectible items. Example that instantly comes to my mind are Martin guitars. Really good brand of guitar, great for bluegrass players. The older ones, especially back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, especially before World War II, are collector's items. And in some years, there were only, I think, like in 1938, there was one particular model that they made 13 guitars out of this particular specific model. And to my knowledge, there's one in existence left. So there's exactly one of this guitar left in existence in the world. So I can't just go out and buy that guitar at any store. So what do you think happened to the price? A guitar that probably cost, I don't know, $50, maybe a little more in 1938, which is right after the Great Depression. A guitar that cost $50 to someone then, maybe $100 at the most, now is worth, I think it was over $2.5 million. And is it because that there's no other guitar anywhere else in the world? No, you can go out to any music store and buy a Martin. But it's that specific Martin and the fact that there's only one in existence. So there's a shortage in supply of that specific Martin. Anyway, tangent. So that's how supply and demand can affect the equilibrium price. Elasticity of demand. As we've seen, the quantity demanded of most goods rests heavily on prices charged for those goods. In most cases, demand is elastic. If prices go up, people will buy less. This phenomenon is known as the price elasticity of demand. When the price of natural gas goes up, a good number of people in a well-wooded region may try to lower their heating bills by installing wood-burning stoves. Because the demand for firewood then increases, gradually the price of firewood will rise, but not perhaps to the high price of natural gas. The availability of substitutes is a major reason why the demand for most goods is elastic. Okay? So we gave the example of a loaf of bread the other day. Is it an elastic good? Yeah, to some degree. If Heiner's old-fashioned bread suddenly went from $2 a loaf to $4 a loaf, I'd buy great value. I may not like it. It may not taste as good to me. But I'm not going to pay $4 for a loaf of bread. Sorry, it's just not going to happen. So there is some elasticity in price. If consumers will pay very high prices for a particular commodity because they feel there are no substitutes, we say that the demand for that good is inelastic. For example, some pharmaceutical companies are able to sell certain products for high prices because there are no known substitutes for those medications. Even if the price of cigarettes skyrockets, many people who are addicted to nicotine will continue to buy as many cigarettes as before because their desire for cigarettes is inelastic, even though those smokers are probably well aware that cigarettes do them physical harm. Demand curves give a good indication of the price elasticity of the demand for a good. The steeper the slope, the more inelastic the demand of that good. So, can you think of an example of an elastic or an inelastic good? Something that's inelastic, something that is a place where that one company or one producer has the market on that specific good. Can you think of anything? Okay. What about EpiPens? Who knows what an EpiPen is, right? If you're allergic to something, deathly allergic, and you're going to go into anaphylactic shock if you come in contact with it, peanut butter, wasps and hornets, they make a device called an EpiPen. It's a shot that a normal person can carry around, purchase, and if they get stung or if they come into contact with something that's going to cause them their airways to close off, they can take it, jab it into their hip, push the button, and ta-da! It's epinephrine. It basically shocks their system and resets it. There's one or two companies that produce EpiPens, and it was in the news recently because Governor Manchin's daughter, I believe it was, is on the board of the company that produces EpiPens, and there's no other company that's allowed to produce them. And because of that, a single EpiPen can cost, $700, $800. And sometimes insurance won't even cover that cost. And you're like, well, how can they get away with that? How can they charge that for a life-saving product and there not be any competition? Well, copyrights, trademarks, patents, all that kind of stuff. But it's an inelastic good. There's no competition. I can't go out and buy a great value brand EpiPen at Walmart. They just don't exist. So I have to buy the Merck, or I don't remember. I don't think it's Merck. It might be Merck. Brand name EpiPen. That's going to cost me $700 because I have to have it. It's not a choice. It's not an option. If I get stung by a wasp or a hornet, I've got to have that, or I've got to get to someone who does, which thankfully most EMTs and EMS and ambulances carry them with them, specifically for people who have allergies. But even then, you're going to get billed for it. So, take it or leave it, you're stuck with it. But most goods that we think of on a day-to-day basis are elastic. What about iPhones? Is the demand for iPhones elastic? Is the price elasticity of iPhones, is it elastic? Kind of. And the reason for that is an iPhone is a cell phone. And so, if I don't want to pay $900 for an iPhone, do I have other options? Can I buy an LG V20? Can I buy a Samsung Galaxy, super ultra large 9000? I mean, my brother had one of those. It was like a brick and holding up to the side of his head. I have other options, and so there is some elasticity there. But generally, most goods are going to be somewhat elastic. You'll find some certain goods that are inelastic, but most of them will fall under an elastic good. So, do consider 4.5, turn it in, part of your grade, etc., etc., and we'll pick up tomorrow.